Yeah, we're okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and potentially good evening to everyone. My name is Jamie Toth. I'm one of the speakers today for the webinar on email communications that we're happy to present to you. So I do have the housekeeping slides up. Just some reminders. So this webinar is being recorded for those who are not able to join. All of your lines are muted. If you have any difficulties, our host, Karen Roy, is here to help you. So just let us know in the chat. Please put questions into the chat because we'll address those as we can. And we do plan to take questions also at the end of the session, but we do have a hard stop at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, so 1.5 hour mark. So with that, we're going to get started. So this is our agenda for today. We'll go through some welcome and introductions. We'll cover the objectives for the session today. We're going to dive deep into the guidance document that was created. Russell will take us through the RGR, regulations, guidance, and also references. And then we will talk about ongoing email communications management. And finally, our favorite topic is archiving. So let's start with welcome and introduction. So first I want to thank Karen Roy from Flex Global, who is helping us out today with the back-end activities, and also will be conducting our polls for us. So thanks, Karen, for joining us. And
no problem. Just to let you know, Jamie, you now have over 150 people on. So
awesome. Thank you. All right, so here's the presenters for today. So myself, Jamie Toth, I'm a Senior Director, Clinical Systems and Records at Daiichi Sankyo. I'm also a TMF Reference Model Steering Committee member and a member of the HSRAA Operations Committee, as well as on the SAG Limited Board of Directors. Over to you, Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Mercer. I work for CGI Technologies and Solutions. While they're based in Montreal, I'm here from the Philadelphia area. I'm the trial master file subject matter expert for our operations in the Philadelphia area. Russell, over to you.
Hello, I'm Russell Joyce. I'm the token presenter from the UK today. I'm the director of Heath Barracliff Consulting, an independent information governance consultancy specializing in life sciences. I'm also, like Jamie, a member of the Tmf Reference Model Steering Committee and a director of the Health Sciences Records and Archives Association. Thank you all for joining. Nice to meet you virtually. Okay, so yeah, thank you. So the objectives today, really, if you'll forgive the shameful promotion of our guidance, is to really increase awareness of the TMF reference model guidance for the management of email communications in clinical studies. This is a document that has long been awaited, and a team of about 10 or 12 of us worked on for some time to produce. It's been particularly well received. One of the comments that we've had, quite a few of the comments that we've had come back are, we'd really like to have a workshop on this and to understand exactly what the application of this means in the workplace. And so we've created this workshop for today to share our ideas with you, to promote the guidance itself, and to take questions from you and answer those, to give you some idea of how it might be of use to you in the workplace, so that you can better understand how to manage your email communications. We do want it to be as interactive as we possibly can. So please feel free to add any questions you have to the chat function on the webinar today, and we'll deal with those questions throughout the course of the webinar, and have some time at the end for a questions and answer session. So thank you very much. So just to get things off to a start, we'd be interested to know exactly the type of organisation that each of you comes from, It's of great help to us to know who has an interest in these kind of webinars and who specifically has an interest in managing email communications. So if you'd like to answer the poll questions on there, you just need to click on one of the options there, and Karen will find out once the majority of people have answered. We have now, I believe, 200 people, which is terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Actually, 218 now.
That's terrific. Just goes to show that there's a lot. I'm going to do a print screen for the responses for you, Karen.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to wait until we get to 200 people answered, because then you get the majority of people. So I'm going to give it 20 more seconds. And I'm going to end the polling now, because we've got nearly 90% of people that have answered. So end the polling and share the results. Clear winner.
Absolutely. I would have thought maybe there would have been more from CROs actually, but
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, because I know certainly from my experience with clients is the sharing of email communications between sponsors and CROs is a terrific matter of concern, both for sponsors and CROs, and is one of those areas that unfortunately gets left at the end of the trial. In my experience, generally fairly badly managed. Okay, so thank you for that. If we'd like to move on with the rest of the slides, yes. Jamie.
All right. So I'm going to now tell you about a little bit about the guidance document, its origin, and also the team that worked on it and what we were thinking when we were working on it. So the objective for the guidance document was to create a document that would address the cross-industry issues associated with email, including how relevant communications was defined for a trial or study, and ensuring also the retention of those emails, and that they're managed in an authoritative system. So the scope that we had was recommendations and positions around those items, relevant communications. We wanted to also include a cross viewpoint from CRO, sponsor, vendor, and consultant. And what was out of scope was identifying a technical solution to help the problem. So because that was really not our remit to create or identify one technology tool. We kicked off October 2019, and we had 4 sub-teams that created chapters for the document and then brought it all together. So if your name is on this slide, thank you. This was a team that worked together over a year to pull the document together. Thank you to all of those members who were part of the team, diligently working together in many, many meetings over that year's time to get the document ready for release. So this is the overview of the guidance document, and we do have a slide at the end that tells you how do you download it off of the tmfreferencemodel.com. But the guidance itself is 21 pages. It's only 21 pages because we wanted it to, be spaced nicely. Obviously, it's not every line filled in. However, it includes effective filing of emails, responsibility, attachments, branching or threads of emails, unblinding emails, archiving, and also gives you the regulations and information on different repositories and preservation format options. So here's where to find the document on the tmfreferencemodel.com website, and it's under resources, and then you go down to TMF tools, and you'll see the electronic communications guidance listed in that section. All right. So, and again, thank you to the sub-team that worked on the document with all of us. So now now Russell's going to go through the regulations, guidance, and references.
Thanks, Jamie. So we've listed here on this slide the regulations that we cover in the guidance document itself. As with most regulations, these tend not to be prescriptive actually, and few regulations really make reference or direct reference to communications themselves. Rather, what they do is they refer to documents generally that permit evaluation of the conduct of the trial, ensure quality of the data, and demonstrate compliance with regulatory standards of GCP. You know, this absence of specificity really means that the regulations are largely open to interpretation, which is where this document comes into its own. So there are some outliers amongst these, and I just wanted to pick out three really. The MHRA Good Clinical Practice Guide, the Grey Guide. This does make specific reference to correspondence, saying that correspondence really is important in reconstructing trial conduct, with organisations relying solely on email correspondence to confirm sponsor approval processes, documents and decisions, and only relevant correspondence that is necessary for the reconstruction of key activities and decisions or contains other significant information must be retained. Although that's very useful, it doesn't actually give us any clear indication of what might be relevant. So again, this is covered in the document itself, and we'll be going on to cover that in this presentation too. ICH GCPE 6R2 again states that relevant communications, other than site visits, letters, meeting notes, notes of telephone calls, that document any agreement or significant discussions regarding trial administration, protocol violations, trial conduct, or adverse event reporting should be retained. So there we have at least some indication of what is meant by relevant, which is particularly helpful. But the one I'd like to reference to, the last one on this list, is the MHRA blog on the MHRA website. I think this is particularly useful from an inspection point of view. That blog says that a common area for inspection findings on documentation is that correspondence associated with key decision-making and trial conduct. The correspondence section in the ETMF is very often sparse or lacks the relevant emails. It's often the case that a number of emails can be provided to explain the issue, but it's unclear why they were not present in the TMF. So there's clear indication that during a regulatory inspection, the inspectors are reliant on email communications being maintained within the trial master file, because communications very often tell the story and give an indication of the what, who, where, why, and when of any actions or decisions that are being undertaken. So from a regulatory perspective, yes, email communications are important, they tell the story, and there is an expectation that the inspectors will have access to them. And if we recall that inspectors want to have direct access to the TMF, we really should be looking at maintaining our communications within our TMF solution. Okay, next slide, please, Jamie.
Right, I'll take it from here. The next section that we're going to deal with here is specifically around email communications management. One of the things that we did want to point out is it's really up to each organization to have policies or procedures or guidance on deciding how to manage email communications within the trial master file itself. Next slide, please. So some of the topics that we're going to cover is something that Russell spoke to previously, which is what is relevant, because that's the key to managing email communications within the trial master file. We'll talk a little bit about email formats, filing locations, filing responsibility, email subject lines and subject matter. Some of the issues that people may have down the line in terms of, let's say, inspections that happen 5 years after the filing is clarity on subject lines and subject matter. So we'll talk a little bit about that. email attachments and embedded links within those emails, and then lastly, the communications containing unblinded information. Next slide, please. So some of the considerations for determining what is relevant for communication is, does the email contain agreements or significant discussions or key decisions regarding things such as administration and conduct of the study, protocol instructions, clarifications and violations, safety information and reporting, awareness of issues arising during the study committees or boards or regulatory authorities, and processes or decisions made where there is no SOP or policy to support the process or decision. So things like substantial discussions or exchanges relative to study strategy and operational considerations. Are there any risks or issues impacting the conduct of the study? Are there communications regarding escalation or resolution of these risks or issues? Decisions for information considered and decision-making processes. Again, these are helpful if you have an inspection 5 or more years down the road where people who were not part of those decisions are no longer available for questions regarding those subjects. Any training provided and details related to the development and delivery of those trainings, and communications or process expectations or instructions and special requests. Next slide, please.
So, Karen, I do see the chat, I think, is blinking. However, I can't bring it up on my screen. So I don't know if there's any questions that have come through.
Just one question that I wanted I'll throw the question out to you, no problem. Will the slides be available afterwards?
Yes.
There is one question which might be worth one of you considering answering, which is that the FDA seems silent on this, and was there an outreach to them for comment? So I don't know whether you want to talk about that during the process or whether somebody wants to address that directly.
So the FDA was not reached out to for comment on this paper. The references that Russell shared are the references that are available around relevant communications. So this is, what is in those references as well, and also from MHRA and other areas. That is where this was developed from. So I don't know if Russell or Mark, you want to add to that.
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that we didn't go to any regulator actually to seek their approval. I don't think any regulator actually is going to endorse this any more than they endorse anything like the trial master file reference model. What this guidance is based on are our interpretation of the regulations and also experience that we collectively have, not only as the group creating this guidance, but also as a wider group, because it has been reviewed by the steering committee as well. So it is an interpretation, it is guidance. You don't have, it's not law, you don't have, or regulation, you don't need to follow it. It's our recommendation for best practice based on interpretation and recommendation.
Yeah, and as Mark mentioned in the beginning of this section, each organization needs to consider it and then apply or not apply based on your organization SOPs, practices, etc.
Just one comment to make, Russell. There's a comment that we can't hear you, so maybe you could just tip your microphone up a little bit towards your mouth.
Yeah,
thank you.
On that, thank you.
All right, so I think we have the next poll. Go ahead, Russell.
Okay, so our next question is, how do you store emails in your TMF? And we're asking how you store them today, not how you intend to store them, or we're not looking for a right answer. There is no right answer, if I'm absolutely honest. It's really as a guide for us to know what current practice is in the wider world outside of the TMF reference model and steering committee. So if you'd like to have, give us an answer to one of those three questions, that would be great.
So we've got 60% that have voted so far, Russell, just to keep you up to date.
Hats off to the people on this call. They're very responsive.
But I have to say we have 259 now, which is interesting. And you'll notice that there's a couple of people who have said both, so both in native and in rendered PDF, which
we didn't put that under other, I think.
Yeah, and there is a question about what is rendered, so you might want to answer that one as well when you get to it.
I think we'll be covering that in the format section. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got 80% that have voted, so I'm going to close it in, give everybody 10 more seconds. Lots of votes coming in. Right, I'm going to end the polling now. Done. And I will share the results. There you go.
Pretty much what I'd expected, if I'm honest. Yeah, most people are keeping them in native format. That's my experience, certainly. Mostly keeping the emails within their email client, such as Outlook or Google Mail. Interesting to see when people render them to PDF, whether that's purely for archiving purposes or they do that during the conduct of the study. Any other comments from Jamie or Mark?
Sure. So some systems, if the email is put into a electronic trial master file, some systems do render the PDF. They do the PDF renditioning right within the system. So the source is there, but also the rendered PDF.
Okay.
Good. Can I make a very quick request, which is if anybody wants to make a comment, can you make sure you do it to everybody? Otherwise it comes just to me and the speakers can't see it. Thank you. And so speakers, there are some questions coming in. I will leave you should be, I'll make sure they're to everybody and then you can pick them up as you go.
Yeah, there was a couple of questions about what is rendered. So Russell, do you want to talk about what it means to render an email?
So I was coming on to that, but yes, to render the email is to put it into a different format. So you might convert your .msg mail from Outlook into a PDF format. For numerous purposes, you may do it to share it with other people. You may do it to make sure that it's being preserved for eternity, because that will be a much better preservation format. Or you may decide to render it to another format, such as RTF. Although I couldn't particularly think of a good reason for doing that. But it's essentially changing the format of the email to another format for some purpose or another. So and we've had a question from Lucy here, which is, are there any problems with rendering and what do we do with any attachments? So the rendering process, if you're using PDFA, for example, you should be able to render a communication to PDFA and maintain the attachments itself. We're going to come on to the retention of attachments later. I think that's something Mark is going to cover. And Lucy also asked, would you need Acrobat Pro to collate them all together? I'm going to cover that very shortly, actually. Generally, I wouldn't use a package to render everything together in one section because it makes it more difficult to find and you might not be able to open it. So it's probably best to retain each individual email. Have we got another poll after this, Jamie? Because a lot of the questions that are coming up.
No, we have file. Yeah, file formats is next.
Can we go to that then? Because a lot of the questions that are coming up are related to this.
Yeah. Okay. We will.
So again, the regular. Next slide.
Yeah. There we go.
Okay, regulations are not clear on this. They're not prescriptive on it. So in terms of determining your best format, For integrity purposes, I would recommend wherever possible to retain your emails in their native format. So for Outlook emails, that would be in .msg. For Google email, that would be in .eml format. MSG has been with us for absolutely ages and is probably one of the most stable Microsoft formats there is. Most people, the vast majority of people, are using Outlook as their communications client. So it generally tends to be universally acceptable. But along with that, you would need to maintain all your associated metadata, because that is what ensures the provenance, authenticity, integrity, and the evidential value of your communication. So the metadata will include elements such as the date and time of communication being sent, the sender and the recipients, subject line field, even the size of the email, the route it took, the IP addresses from which it was sent and to which it was delivered, content type, the MIME version, server threads, and all that information, as well as the message text and the content and signature blocks and attachments if relevant. So keep it in a native format certainly preserves its integrity, and that's an important consideration when that's a really hot topic with the regulatory authorities. So maintaining it in its native format is important, not just for the initial email, but for each subsequent response, because most email applications allow an individual responding to modify the preceding message in that thread, including the header information. So you could change the name of the person that sent it and the individuals to whom it was sent. You could, if you wanted, change the date and time of that the email was sent. And that of course impacts on its integrity. So these after the fact modifications do potentially impact on authenticity, trustworthiness of the email, which diminishes its evidential weight. For regulatory inspection purposes though, it's often acceptable to retain emails in a non-native format, so you could render them to PDF. You could print them if you really wanted to, but that's not particularly useful, and we'll come on to discuss that. Although caution should be exercised to make sure that you maintain as much of the integrity of the email as possible. And rendering to PDF will certainly give you that option. But each organisation will need to determine its own filing formats and what's acceptable in terms of retaining these emails in the ETMF. A lot of ETMF will automatically render to PDF, and generally that's fine. Not excluding what's gone before, you really need to give consideration to the longevity and usability of the format. How are you going to be able to preserve it for a long time? For ATIMP, for example, you need to retain your documentation for 30 years. That's an awful long time in technological terms. And when I talk about reusability, are you going to be able to do things like forward and response to the email should you need to do so? You need to think about text searchability. How am I going to find that email? Am I going to rely on key terms or keywords to find those? What the relationship between the email and its associated artifact will be. And if you're going to convert to native format to a non-native format, such as PDF, do you need to validate that conversion process? And how do you prove that? And if you're working with third parties, such as a CRO or an investigator, it's really imperative that, as well as handling and storage and management of the emails, you do agree a transfer process in advance, and you document that in your TMF plan. So there are a number of options there available to you. I think it's for the organisation itself to decide which is the most appropriate for it, and then to stick with that decision and make sure that that is being documented. And of course, to monitor it on a regular basis as well.
So Russell, so the questions that came up regarding the rendering, so just a comment, we're not going to comment on specific systems. However, you know, there is a question around a render not occurring correctly for PDF. And so I know from my experience, a lot of times it's the actual document that's corrupted, or the document might be, there's something in the document that is causing that. And usually troubleshooting what that particular vendor and that system had resolved that. I don't know, Mark or Russell, if you have any comments around if a PDF renders and there's like gibberish, what to do or anything like that.
Well, I think with any migration or conversion, you should have some kind of validation being done on that process to make sure that it works properly. And then check those periodically to make sure that you don't have those issues. So that would be my advice to do that. The validation process should highlight whether or not there are any systematic or consistent errors that are occurring, so that you can then set some kind of remediation plan and action in place to make sure that doesn't occur in future.
Yeah, and another thing to consider is it's not always the rendering process that's at issue. Sometimes the source document is corrupted. So obviously, if the source document is corrupted, when you render it, your rendering will fail. So there should be quality checks in place to make sure that your source documents have integrity prior to rendering them. And as Russell said, validating a process to do that is a good step in the right direction.
One key example that I can recall from my past experience is a document that had embedded like DocuSign or electronic signature or within it, and the render, there was corruption within that e-signature block, and that was the root cause of the rendering to be gibberish. But that's the only example I can think of at the moment.
Yeah, that's
the other one thing I'd like to pick up on there is a question from Yasmin, which Eldin, thank you very much, Eldin, has responded to, which is about saving your emails to a CD. CDs are not an acceptable storage medium for archiving, so we would not endorse doing that at all. And that applies not just to email, but to any format, any form of documentation at all. So thank you, Eldin, for that. I just wanted to stress this.
Thank you. I was going to actually say we could get to that one. I think it's later on with archiving, but so Yasmina, the archiving section will go through, what is acceptable as well. All right. So
we have another question from Yasmin there, which is about locations, which I think is the next slide, actually, Jamie.
There you go.
So Yasmin here has asked, what about storing emails in a shared mailbox during the conduct of the trial? Yep, that's absolutely fine. And I think from experience, that's what most organizations are currently doing. But it's really for each organization to provide its own guidance on where they want to file relevant communications. Our recommendation would always be to keep them in the Etmf if you possibly can. That would be the best place because everybody has access to that, and they generally would be kept in a usable format. It allows people to go in and find them and make sure you have that kind of single source of truth throughout the conduct of the trial. For communications that directly align with an artifact, the decision on where to keep those is absolutely clear. But what do you do with a communication containing information that does not directly align with an artifact? The secret to overcoming that, I think, is to consider the purpose of the communication and then to identify the appropriate artifact, section or zone so that the context at least can be preserved. So in some circumstances, you may find the purpose is ambiguous. For example, an email containing a health authority clinical study application approval could be filed under regulatory, or it could be filed under relevant communication or regulatory authority decision. It's for you really to overcome these ambiguities, either by defining in your business rules where such communications would be kept, But in the absence of any specific guidance, I'll just come back to the point that it's really essential to consider the meaning and purpose of the email when deciding the most appropriate filing repository and location. This is going to help you to make sure that the communication is kept in context and ensure that it's more readily retrievable for operational purposes, as well as for audit and inspection. So, as we've already discussed, the regulations tend not to be very specific, but rather more general. And this is certainly the case again regarding location and format in which relevant email communications need to be kept. It's for each organisation to take care to ensure that the emails, wherever they're kept, remain complete and legible so that they can be read and that they can be made available on request. So using a systematic and consistent policy or procedure for your email communications is going to be key to achieving that. Within the guidance itself, we do provide a number of options for retaining your email communications in a digital format. If you look at Appendix 1, that gives you a range of options and advantages and disadvantages associated with each of those options.
Russell, a couple of questions came through that we'll, hyperlinks we'll talk about in a little bit. There was one that came through. So downloading a bulk 10,000 email inbox ready for archiving Tmf. And is that possible? Hang on, it just like moved off the screen for me, sorry. Is that archiving Etmf and Outlook to individual MSG files? How would we go about getting the emails out of a shared Outlook mailbox? So that's a...
Well, that's going to be a difficulty if you're leaving all of your email communications to the end. But I have to say that's, from my experience, that's something that probably happens fairly frequently. The difficulty of doing that, of course, is that then you end up with a mass of emails. It could be 10,000 or more emails in one particular location. That's going to make it particularly difficult to find those emails during, if they're needed operationally or if they're needed for audit or inspection. So my recommendation would be to try and file as best as you can on an ongoing basis rather than leaving it to the end. And that applies to all documentation within your Tmf as well. Don't wait until the very last minute to make sure that you are keeping information that is relevant. If you keep absolutely all of your emails in a study mailbox, you would want to have at least some form of quality control on that to make sure that what you're keeping is actually relevant. If you wait until the very end, trying to trawl through potentially tens of thousands of emails to decide what is relevant and what is not would be particularly burdensome. So do it on an ongoing basis as much as you can. That will make the job much easier for you in the long run.
Yes, and I can totally relate to that. As a sponsor, having a CRO tell us they were going to ship us a CD with 25,000 emails that were in an inbox with no determination on relevant or non-relevant. That did not go over very well because then we would have needed to determine relevancy, and this was throughout the life of a long oncology trial. So certainly making that determination up front on relevancy, and I'll be talking about in a moment, approaches for filing. So there's other questions that came through, hyperlinks and email threading. So I've mentioned we're going to go through those in a moment. I'm just checking if there's any questions for filing location. Mark, Russell, can you see any?
Yeah, there's a couple of discussions about avoiding duplication of emails and emails that are relevant to, I guess, multiple zones. I think there was one comment or question about that.
Yeah, so I think we're covering that later on, actually, in
Yes.
in the presentation.
So that's
yeah,
going to be covered later.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's one about zip files to upload multiple emails.
Yeah, zip files can be problematic, can't they, if you don't have the program to open the zipped file. So I'd avoid using zip files or Adobe Portfolio if I were you. They can be more problematic than perhaps you realise.
Yeah.
And also 5-10 years from now, if those zips and Adobe portfolios are in your ETMF, are they going to open, right? And we'll talk about archiving, you know, as the last section, but if those zips are in the archive and WinZip or PKZip or whatever the zip program goes away and gets replaced by some other, I don't know, Microsoft program, what do you do with those zips, right? If you cannot open them. Okay, so
before you move on, actually, there's one question there from Diane, finding it difficult. Sorry, from Janine. What about keeping just the final email and not all the back and forth? I'd already spoken, actually, I think on the previous slide, that if you keep just the final email, any emails in the string or the thread that precede that can potentially be changed and the integrity of them could be compromised. So the recommendation is really, as much as it may seem burdensome, to keep the initial email and each subsequent response or reply.
Can I just
going to talk about that in a moment?
Yeah, can I just add a comment? And I think Diane's point is true. There's so many questions coming in.
Yeah.
I would suggest maybe that the questions get held and see if you answer them, and then at the end go through them. Because I think there's so many people with so many questions for you.
I know my fear though, Karen, is at the end to scroll through all of it. I don't know. We'll see. Okay.
I'll see if I can maybe pull them out and put them into something simple for you.
Okay.
Thanks, Karen.
All right. Thank you. All right, we're going to move on. We have our next poll coming up. All right, so a question for the audience. What is the frequency of TMF emails being filed? So do you file contemporaneously throughout the duration of the study, periodically, during the conduct of the study, or at study closure? And this is being filed into the ETMF or into the TMF if you have paper. So you can all see my response.
Sorry, we have 185 people that have commented so far. We have 275 people online now.
Awesome.
This is amazing.
So Jamie, Mark, are you going to make any guesses as to what the answer might be here?
I hope I don't see study closure.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
Me too.
I think you're going to find there are. I think you're going to find there are some.
Oh, I bet you it's more than just some.
Right, so we're going to get to, hang on, I'm going to get to 80%. So come on, guys, you've got another 10 seconds to answer.
A classic case of reality not meeting expectations, I think, Mark.
All right, 2 and 9. Right, I'm going to end the polling now, and I want to share the results. Hopefully you'll see the results.
Oh, that's good. 54%, that's nice to see.
Good answer.
Yes.
33, 12% study closure. All right. So that's, you know, great to see actually, because 5 years ago, I crossed the CRO bridge back to pharma, and this was probably very different back then when I was working with my CROs as a sponsor. So happy to see this now. 54% is a lot better than probably what it was back 5 years ago. And, you know, that probably speaks to the technology advances, and obviously as the world has been changing, where, you know, everything does need to be in the online system in order to actually view it. So great to see that. So we do have another poll. This is poll number 4. So who is responsible for filing emails into the TMF? So we have originator of the communication, the primary recipient of the communication, a central group or other individuals responsible for filing all communications, and other. And if it's other, please specify in the chat, and then I'll ask Karen to kind of tell us what that other is.
Just a quick comment. There's a question about will the polls and results be shared after the call? Yes, so we're capturing the screenshots of all the polls and they will be, I'm assuming, put into the presentation.
Absolutely.
So I'll give you a couple of the other answers. Clinical trial administrator, specified by the TMF plan or index per TMF plan SOP, CRO, all of the above depending on the process and functional line, or filed by CST support or the email organizer based on the agreement. And other is whoever is assigned the responsibility, and internal email originator, external recipient. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea, and we've got nearly 80% that have voted. So I'm going to end the polling now and I'm going to share the results. There you go.
So 38.
I think that's great to see that 38% of people are making the originator of the communication save that email. Central group or individuals, I'm assuming that is the clinical trial administrator for most people.
Right, so it could be a centralized group that files all the correspondence contemporaneously into the ETMF, perhaps.
Yes.
41%, okay. Yeah, we did show that, which is interesting, that there's only 18% of the attendees are CRO and 72% are sponsors. So, so interesting. Okay, thank you all. I'm taking notes so I can remember as we go along as well. Okay, so we are now going to talk about filing responsibilities. So as we mentioned, and what the poll talked about was you need to determine not just the who is going to file, but when. And so the recommendation would be to have this in your TMF plan, and where you're talking about, in particular, the relevant correspondence, how it's going to be filed, when it's going to be filed, as well as the who. So if you have certain key correspondences that need to be filed, it should be determined well up front how that filing is going to happen, so it's not a surprise towards the end of the trial. So obviously contemporaneously throughout the duration of the study, that is based on EMA guidance for documentation added in a timely manner. MHRA also talks about this, but obviously keeping the TMF continuously up to date and inspection ready at all times. A lot of times those relevant correspondences regarding it could be monitoring visits or other aspects that, as Mark talked about, with what is relevant. If they're not filed at the end and you have an inspection and the trial is still ongoing, then that key correspondence is not in the TMF. If you're doing it periodically during the conduct of the study, you should have a plan for what does that mean? Is it monthly? Is it weekly? Is it quarterly? Ensuring that all the correspondence that gets filed is only the relevant correspondence. And then at study closure, which it sounds like that is not the norm of what people are doing, so that's good to see. So that's only 12%. And if you are filing at study closure, you might want to take a look at, what does that mean, and how are you going to ensure that you have everything that's relevant, or if you're able to bring forward communications that are necessary to support an inspection, how would you do that if they're not already filed in the TMF? So the who is going to file is also, again, recommended to be documented in your TMF plan. So the two options that we talk about in the guidance is the originator of the communication and also the primary recipient of the communication. And we'll talk about subject lines and email threading and things like that that happen along the way for when it may make most sense. But the key point is that each organization needs to decide the filing of the communication, who's going to do it, and you might have a specific group that files everything related to a monitoring visit report that comes through an email. You might have, another group that files, anything that is study relatable, but is also TMF content that needs to be filed. But that's for each organization to decide and create your policies, procedures around that. But then also you might want to, once you make that decision, you might want to do periodic checks and quality checks to ensure that key relevant communications have been filed by those groups and at the time that you have said would be filed. All right, so we now have another poll.
So here's another poll for you. Do you, meaning your organization, have a policy for the content of the email subject lines? And we have yes, no, or unsure as the possible answers.
And just so you know, what I'm going to do to the speakers while everyone's answering that is that's not what I'm going to do to the speakers. What I'm going to do is I'm pulling all the questions so that anything that got hidden before, and I'll put them in the chat, but if there are, I'll put them all together so they're condensed basically.
You're awesome.
To make life easier. So.
Thanks, Karen.
No worries.
All right, so we have 273 people on.
And there are some comments, for example, at the moment, someone said subject line requirements are in the PMOP, whatever a PMOP is.
Yeah.
Project management, operational, something or other, I guess. And okay, so we've got 80% that have voted. So I'm now going to end the polling and I'm going to share the results. There you go.
Okay.
I wonder if the policy for email subject lines is related specifically to clinical studies, or whether there is actually within an organization an email policy that deals with this. And because it's not specific to clinical, that people are not following it.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting, Russell. I mean, there was recent surveys in the industry that came out end of the summer, early fall, and it did talk about one of the things it talked about was a lot of manual filing, manual this, manual that, but also email and the reliance on email, especially during COVID, became more, right? Because we're not in the office, so people are emailing everything, and so. It's probably a good time for companies to make a, campaign for, this is what you use email for, but this is what you use other tools for, like, the new, MS Teams and Office 365, et cetera, because now the reliance on email has even grown because people aren't they don't see people in the office space, so they are emailing everything. And that just kind of gets the inbox is even more cluttered up and cluttered up and cluttered up to probably make good decisions around relevant correspondence and communications. So Mark, any other comments on this poll?
I thought Angela had a very good point. I think it was Angela's. Having a policy and getting everyone to comply are two different things. Well said, but
yes.
Having a policy is a good first step.
Yeah, that's the starting point. Absolutely.
I think having senior management support
Mm,
for your policies and procedures will certainly help embed a culture of compliance within the organisation. And that applies across everything, not just to this subject matter.
exactly. All right, shall we move on to the next slide?
Sure.
Okay. Email subject matter. So one of the big issues that I've seen with email filings in TMFs is changing the subject matter without changing the subject line, right? So you think the email message is about something, but somewhere down the road, the subject matter changes, but you're not keyed into that by the subject line.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why we had the poll about a policy, because again, part of the value of storing your email messages about decision-making, relevant conversations about those decisions in the TMF is great. But if you're not aware that the subject matter actually changed in a key email, that becomes a problem during an inspection, right? So if you miss that entirely by just glancing at the subject line, thinking the email message is about X, when in fact it's about Y, causes a lot of churn of, oh, we made that decision, but I can't seem to find it in my TMF. Some things to consider.
Yeah, I hate when people do that. That is very problematic. I just want to comment on that because that happens every day.
I think it's happened to all of us at one point in time.
Yep.
So one of the things to think about in terms of a policy is some direction about, hey, if you're going to change the subject matter, you should be changing the subject line, either starting a new thread, or if you're replying to a existing thread, changing the subject line if you're going to change the content. So starting a new email with this new subject line would be the preference. But if you can't, when you reply, change that subject line to make it more relevant to that change in conversation. All right. Let's, I think we've got another slide. Jamie? Great. So some points about subject lines. Are they concise and focused? This allows a user or an inspector to readily understand the purpose of that communication. I talked about that a little bit in the previous slide. Is it repetitious? Obviously, you don't want to have unnecessary email content in your TMF. It should be avoided, that replication of elements, unless it's necessary for understanding. And what I mean by elements, are you repetitious in terms of the folder path in the subject line or the metadata? So is the subject line the same thing for constant repetition on that replies to the email? That's great if it's necessary, but if it's not necessary, you should avoid that. Is the subject line meaningful? Is it unambiguous? Is it meaningful for the content of that message? The subject line should clearly identify the subject matter and ensure that the recipient of that email is immediately aware of the topic. Is it relatable to one topic? You know, one of the questions we had, or one of the chat messages that we had, is what to do with emails that cover, you know, a variety of subjects. Where do you file that? If you have a policy of making emails specific to one topic and you start a new email if that topic diverges, that can avoid those questions about where to file that communication. You know, which zone does it belong in? Also, the notion that the emails stay on topic. right? So if somebody diverges and says, you know, hey, what about this other thing that we're doing, or, you know, something that's really not relevant to a communication that needs to be stored in the TMF, those we should be taking steps to avoid that. And unambiguous, right? Do we have clarity of the content of that email based on that subject line? All right. So I think we have another poll. And this is on storing emails with attachments. All right. So we have yes, no, or unsure. And just based on the work that I've done with my clients, almost everybody stores emails with attachments. But it'd be interesting to see what people's responses are.
I think I'd agree with you, Mark, that that's fairly commonplace.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say there's a clear winner here.
Right.
I'm sure there is.
I'm gonna hazard my guesses at number one.
I'm gonna say 80% yes and 20% unsure.
Oh, I'm impressed, Jamie. I'm impressed. And you can't see the results, just so you know.
Not yet.
No, I can't.
No, we can't. No.
I'm going to end the polling now because although we're about approaching 80% have voted, but I'm going to end the polling and share the results. Ta-da!
Yeah, look at that.
Hey.
I need to play the lottery today.
Yeah, very close. Awesome.
All right. And we'll be talking about attachments and embedded links in a moment. So, so this is good to see. So the next poll.
Yes. Do you allow embedded links with your emails? So again, it's the same responses, yes, no, or unsure.
Yeah.
Apologies, I was doing the questions. Am I supposed to have launched another poll?
Yes,
yes.
please.
Oh, sorry. I'm busy reading all the questions. Give me a sec.
Rather our job than yours, Karen.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely on a multitasking. So email embedded links is the one we want, yes?
That's correct.
Yes.
Sorry about that. I was
That's
just
all right.
reading all the questions.
So do you allow embedded links with your emails that are stored in the ETMF? Yes, no, or unsure.
Be interesting to see what we get for a response.
Let's hope that people understand what we mean by embedded links.
Perhaps
Yeah.
we should have explained that.
Explained it, yeah.
I
My concern, Mark.
I believe it's in our definition.
It's in our definition, but I'm not sure everybody on this webinar has read
So,
application.
yep. So an embedded link is a hyperlink that's contained within the email communication. Typically activated by clicking on the highlighted word or icon or the particular location on the screen to take the reader to another location.
There you go.
There we go.
A little bit different.
Yeah. Perhaps a bit more concerning as well, I would suggest, Mark. I know you're going to cover that though.
As we will illustrate in the next slide.
All right. So thank you for that. We're going to talk about those items in a moment. I think that went away. I don't know where it actually went on my screen. Okay, so attachments and embedded links. So I know we got a lot of questions up about this early on, talking about attachments. So this this section probably had the biggest debate and discussion amongst our working group to come up with language and verbiage, because we thought through, I think we thought through a lot of if then else type of scenarios to come up with what made sense. And then also when we met with our steering committee to get finalization, this was also another hot topic with the steering committee to make sure that it was well understood and what we were saying made sense. So attachments and embedded links. So when do you file into the ETMF? So what we said was if an email contains an attachment, which my team at Daiichi Sankyo knows I hate attachments in email. But if an email contains an attachment and it's already filed in the TMF or the ETMF, actually in the ETMF, right? Because it's electronic, it's an email. The email referencing the attachment does not need to be filed again as part of the email. However, and this is where we talk about, content of an email. If the content of the email message is relevant, then you should file the email, including the attachment, as a relevant communication. So it does take a thought process, and this again is why we said, and asked, do you have an email policy? Because it does take, is the attachment already filed in the ETMF, but now what does the content of the message say, and is that actually relevant? So we did say that if an email contains an attachment that is not filed within the ETMF already, then you need to make some considerations. So do you, I'm sorry, Russell, you're saying something?
No, somebody's off mute.
Oh, okay. So if the content of the email message is relevant, but the attachment, and the attachment is relevant, then you should file into the ETMF, including the attachment as relevant communication. But we also say, file the attachment separately. So a lot of times you'll have an attachment that is pertaining to a specific artifact type in your TMF index. And yes, I'm talking artifact type based on a TMF reference model. So you may want to file that attachment into that artifact type, but also then retain the full email with the relevant communication, as well as the that includes the attachment. And we saw that in our poll where people are storing the emails with attachments in their ETMF. When you store the email with the attachment in the ETMF, if you have a system that renders, it's going to render a PDF, but hopefully that system also retains the source, right? So you file the email, it renders to PDF, but if you need to get to the attachment, the source is available. If the content of the email is not relevant, but the attachment is relevant, file only attachment separately to its relevant artifact. And I talked about filing into the artifact area. So when we talk about embedded links, we are saying avoid the use of embedded links, and this will probably begin more and more with the onset of all of us have been working from home now for almost a year. Embedded links do change, right? So we do say avoid where possible the use of embedded links for relevant communications, because that link may not be accessible in the future. So, if I send something to team members within an embedded link, I leave the company, my OneDrive gets, archived, and you're not able to get to that link. So for TMF purposes and filing of TMF, we are saying it is recommended to avoid the use of embedded links in the emails because it's difficult to maintain traceability between the email communication and where that embedded link takes you to. So if you have an embedded link, that embedded link, hyperlink, is considered a relevant artifact. You should go to the link, download what is necessary, and then file it into the eTMF at the artifact level. So again, this was probably the most complex to describe and talk about, because there's all these if then else type of scenarios that happen. I do recommend that you read thoroughly the 2 sections in the guidance document, and certainly we will take questions at the end to talk about this more if needed. Okay, so the next topic, again, is a little complex, but this is communications with unblinding information. And we thought, you know, do we include this? Do we not include it? But then we said we probably should, because it has obviously occurred, and across our working body that created the guidance document, obviously it was an issue. So if you have communications that have unblinding information, we're saying to file in the eTMF with a relevant artifact, but you need to control access, restrict it, and maybe you have to do so at a study country site level, depending on how your system is configured, so that it's not accessible by blinded users until the study blind is lifted. If you're not filing these contemporaneously into the eTMF, then you need to establish a process to file the relevant communications that would, you know, potentially lift the blind after the blind has been lifted. So you would need to file all those communications into the eTMF or the TMF, and do so before you actually archive or, you know, send off to long-term storage the TMF. Once your study blind has been lifted, ensure you have controls in place to capture and maintain audit trails. But again, this is for each organization to decide, and you should have some kind of guidance on how this will be done. And where I've seen this actually documented is in the TMF plan, so that, again, up front, everyone knows how this is going to be handled before you're in the situation and you have communications coming through, potentially filing those communications into the eTMF that could, you know, be an issue with the blinding that needs to be in place. All right.
Can I just go back on one thing, actually? Because
sure.
it actually answers a lot of the questions coming in about embedded links. Is the one big problem with embedded links is that they can get broken. Yep. And once they're broken, they're of no use to you. So that would be really the primary reason for not keeping them. Thanks, Jenny.
All right, and just to check on time, 9:13, we have 1 section to go for archiving, so we're doing well on time. So Russell, over to you.
Okay, so our last section is on archiving. We have another poll, if you could bring that up, please, Karen. And our question here is, do you archive your emails with the TMF? So, mindful of the limited time that we have left, we can keep this fairly short, I think, Karen, just to enable some time at the end for questions. That would be great.
Yep, no worries. Everyone's answering very quickly, so we're well over 50% answered already. So no worries at all. In fact, I don't think I need to. There's a clear winner. So I'm going to end it now. So sorry, everybody who's still voting, but there's the results. Clear winner.
Oh, that's good. That's
really good. It'd be interesting actually to understand exactly how people are archiving them. We're going to cover that anyway in the final session, but I think people have very different understandings of what is meant by archiving. So if we can have the next slide up, please, Jamie. From my perspective, being someone who gets involved in quite a few digital archiving projects with my clients, there is a huge difference between simple electronic storage and digital archiving. Archiving is actually making sure that you are preserving the information so that over time it can be both accessible, readable, and where necessary, usable. And that's a very, very specific process. Simply locking your Etmf and leaving your documents there is not archiving, that's simply digital storage. But that's probably a subject for another day to go into detail on. But for the time being, this is probably my mantra for the day. You know, regulations do not stipulate the format in which you need to archive your documents. All they say is that you must take care to ensure that any documentation you do archive maintains its integrity for the duration of the required retention period. That is to say, they must remain accessible, they must remain complete, legible, and readable throughout the period of retention, which for a standard clinical trial is going to be, under the new EU 536/2014 regulations, 25 years, but for ATIMP could be 30 years. That throughout their retention, they must be available upon request, and that they must not be modifiable. And once the study is archived, of course, all documentation for the clinical study must come into the custody of the GCP archivist. And that's absolutely critical. That's now written into the regulations. So in the Appendix 2, I think, in the guidance, we do give some options on preservation formats for email. I'll quickly run through those. The recommended format we suggest is for archives to be converted to a preservation format such as PDF or PDFA, converting both the body of the email and any of its metadata as well, making sure that's added to the PDF file. PDFA1 adds attachments at the end of an email as additional pages. PDFA2 allows the attached PDF files to be embedded, so they're essentially integrated into the email itself. For live records, we would suggest that you keep them in original or native format, which we covered earlier in this presentation. So that is to say, we should have them in .msg format or for Outlook, or EML format for Google Mail. It's acceptable from a regulatory perspective to keep those in a non-native format, so you could convert them to PDF, but you may, or you have to accept the possibility that there'll be a risk of losing things like metadata, such as the header information, and you may require certification for true copy status for your emails. And I think it's common, or it certainly was common practice until fairly recently, for people to print all their emails to paper. We would not suggest that you do this at all these days. It's best to, and we certainly wouldn't recommend that you keep a PST file either, because that's a proprietary format for Microsoft. But printing to paper, or even keeping this PST, actually means that it makes it much more difficult to find your emails. I remember years ago filing 40 boxes of each contained 6 LibreArch files of emails. Trying to find anything in that was going to be impossible. So keep it in native format while it's live, but once you're archiving it, certainly perfectly acceptable to transfer it to a preservation format such as PDFA. Primary thing you need to do is to consider the impact of your preservation format on the integrity, trustworthiness, and reliability of those emails that you are archiving. Okay, thank you, Jamie.
All right.
Left us with 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Russell. So we do have a number of questions and Karen has sent them through. So I'm going to start at the top.
And Jamie, there is a possibility you've answered one or two of these, so if you have
Yeah,
just delete,
so
because I was doing multitasking.
Yep. So the first one is, and I know Russell and Mark, you can see these. So if you file contemporaneously, how do you avoid filing duplicates? For example, how do you define when the email correspondence is final?
We do cover that in the guidance, actually, and it's particularly difficult to know when an email communication is final because of branching, I think, primarily. By branching, I mean that an email can start off from one individual,
right?
From one individual to another, and then be shared out amongst a number of people. Then people can fall off, so that at the end of the email, actually, the person who originated it is no longer involved in the conversation. So branching is a massive problem, as is the subject matter changing as well. So if you can try to avoid looking for the final email in a chain, it can be quite complex. Take a look at the guidance and you'll see an illustration there of what I mean, which may help to visualize it for you.
Thank you. So here's one. How do you get CROs to only file the relevant communication with sites and not all their communication with sites? The latter is easiest for them as they don't need to make a decision on relevance. So here again, in the beginning, when the study is in pre-startup, your TMF plan should be looking to be drafted, and in there you're making the decisions with the CRO and also discussing with the CRO expectations on the filing. So just to give a shout out to the Tmf Plan Template that was created by a working group that I led 2 years back. That Tmf Plan Template is also available on the TMF reference model under TMF tools. In there is a section, and we do talk about this. So I would say up front with your CROs, have a discussion. It could be, before the kickoff meeting and pre-startup to document, what your expectations are. If you have a relevant communications policy that you expect them to follow it and how you would like the filing to be done. Again, this is, organization dependent on your policies, procedures, and your expectations of your CRO. The next question, if emails are copied at time of origin to a central email address repository, and a pointer in the TMF states that is the location of emails, is this considered filing in the TMF? So
is it possible to reword that?
You can see the questions. No, I don't know. That's what it means. So I think they're saying there's a repository for the emails. So I guess I would say if that repository is considered the authoritative source for your emails, and again, organization dependent, I'm not saying I recommend this, but and you're filing outside of the eTMF or TMF, then that would be up to your organization to determine. So that's what it's saying is if you have a repository and a pointer in the TMF saying that's the location of that content, is that considered filing in the TMF?
So the answer to that I would give is, how do you maintain access to that over time? So email, Outlook as an email client is not a suitable archive repository. And how would you provide inspectors with access to that, direct access to that, which is mandated by the regulations, when you would need an @myorganization.org address? That's going to be particularly problematic, I think. And simply maintaining an archive within Outlook is going to really fill your email archive up very, very quickly, I would think. So if you can, look to have that stored in a much more preservation-friendly format and repository.
Thank you. The next question, any ideas on how we get teams, study teams, et cetera, to feel more confident with understanding what is relevant? So I have
read the guidance.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, read the guidance, share the guidance, and especially that section that Mark covered in the beginning, because a lot of that content does come from, you know, what's mentioned in some of the regulations around relevancy. Okay.
And I actually have worked with clients who have used not necessarily this guidance, but the previous guidance that was issued through the HSRAA to form the backbone of standard operating policy or standard operating procedure or policy for email management. So it's fairly easily adapted to those purposes. Yes.
All right, so the next question, if the email is filed in .msg with attachments, but it is a rule to share only viewable rendition with inspectors, and the rendition does not contain the attachment, is it an issue?
I think this goes back to the slide you spoke about earlier,
yes.
Jamie, which is about determining the meaning and the purpose and the relevance of the communication versus the attachment itself.
Well, what I was going to say is, I don't know that it is a rule to share only a viewable rendition with the inspector. If you have the source and you can also download source, then download the source and share that. So again, it depends on your competency in what was filed is relevant. And if you have the source, right? So some eTMF systems, the source is uploaded, but it does the rendition to PDF within it, but you can still get to the source. All right, so here's an interesting question. I'm not sure we can answer this, but would it be fair to apply this email guidance to instant messaging solutions as well?
So, now, there's a $64 million question.
Yeah. And
we've got 3 minutes left, Jamie. Just give a time.
No, I know. I'm keeping a watch on time. I'm just going to hit a couple others because we do have 3 minutes. So, I
think it's fair to say that instant messaging and chat and messaging in Teams and so on and so forth, notoriously difficult to maintain and certainly to preserve the integrity of, because you generally keep it as an RTF type file.
Absolutely.
So
one more question, and then I'm sorry, Mark, did you have a comment?
There was a lot of questions about will the recording be available, and Karen has said that she'll make the recording available on the reference model website.
Yep, we did.
We did talk about doing that, absolutely. So I was going to suggest that.
All right, so one more question, and then I'll cover the last few slides. So let's see. There's just, we're probably gonna have to get to, some of them are just, I can't really, they're probably too in-depth. So let me go to the last few slides just to close us out. So if you have questions or comments about the email guidance, we have 2 areas for you to send to. You can send an email, make sure it's relevant, to email at tmfreferencemodel.groups.io. That comes into myself, Mark, Russell, as well as the other members of our working group. Or you can post on the tmfreferencemodel.com. So underneath the forum section, look for the email communications topic. This is just some information, obviously, about the TMF reference model if you weren't aware, and the website, tmfreferencemodel.com. You can register out there and get chock full of knowledge and networking and obviously too much fun. And then obviously if you're not a current member, you can sign up to join. So with that, we are closing right on time. So I want to thank certainly Karen for helping us on the back end, Mark and Russell for all of your great insights, and it's been a pleasure working with the two of you over the last, oh my gosh, has it been 2 years? I think so. And it's been, you know, we hope you found this very helpful, and we will have a debrief after this call to kind of look at all the other questions that came in and possibly look to how we can respond to them so that all of you get that information. So with that, it's Friday. Thank you, everyone. Have a fabulous
day. Thank you, Jamie.
And we will be in touch.
Nice.
All right, take care.
Thank you, everyone, for contributing. It's been really interesting to have your feedback. Cheers.
Bye all.
Bye.